so ends the book, the word of God for the people of God. So, last week as we talked about Ezra and Nehemiah, they kind of represented this voice of purity and separation, and we came to the conclusion that there is a time and a season for that, of living in but not of the world. Like we maybe would teach our kids, you should love everybody but don't follow them off the cliff, right? There are ways to be a part of everybody and at the same time kind of hold true to who you are and your values and your identity, and so have that understanding of separation. And then there's another set of voices, biblical voices, that are, while respecting that, land far more on the inclusion side, the being embracing, accepting grace. Jonah is one such voice, but he's just one. Probably chronologically, the first of those voices that we've talked about before is Ruth, right? The story of Ruth gets set way back before David, and it's to remind us, while Ezra and Nehemiah are telling you to divorce all these foreign wives, remember, there are foreign women in our lineage. The great-grandmother of King David was Ruth, a Moabite woman. Oh, okay. Kind of on the other end chronologically from that is the story of Esther. We don't often talk about the story of Esther, but she's a great story, and one of these days I really ought to preach on Esther. You might recognize the one verse that comes from that everybody knows is, for a time such as this. Does that ring a faint bell? You can nod your head and I'll believe you. I'll never know. But so Esther actually rises up in the Persian court. Remember, the Persians are the folks who take over from the Babylonians, and while there are some people who returned to Judah, there are a lot of Jews that stay in the land, and Esther and others rise up in the Persian court, and it's Esther who saves her people, convinces the king not to do in the Jews, and there's this whole great story, and it's one of the great Jewish festivals, Purim, which they often do. If you ever get a chance to go to a Purim spiel, which is the Purim story, they usually do it in musical form, and it's done almost comically. And there's this big festival, and it's almost like the Feast of Fools and what some Christian traditions have done with before Ash Wednesday. So it's great fun. Story of Esther who saves the Jews in Persia, and there's kind of this, the Persians aren't all bad. It's cool. And then, of course, we know, we've already heard the voice of Jeremiah talking about the Babylonians and praying for their welfare, even in the midst of exile. In our own Christian story, we come to include the Romans. Oh my goodness. The Romans, who were the not only the oppressors of Jesus' people, but those who crucified Jesus himself. And a Roman soldier even stands at the foot of the cross and says, surely this man was the Son of God. And Judaism itself goes back and revisits some of its own scriptures to include even their original enemy, the Egyptians, as part of God's people. You've heard me talk about this midrash before, this additional story that Judaism adds to the tradition. If not, I will remind you. You might remember back to the Exodus that as the Egyptian army, Pharaoh, and the chariots are crossing through the sea, the Israelites have already entered out on the other side, and all of a sudden the water comes in, and Pharaoh's army drowns, and the angels in heaven begin to rejoice, and God says, hush! Shuts the angels up and says, those were my people too. Don't rejoice. And so you have this long tradition of the inclusion even of Israel's arch enemies. all the way back from the Egyptians to the Canaanites, to the Babylonians, to the Persians, to the Romans. And there's one little gap here that Jonah fills in, the Assyrians. We won't talk about the Assyrians nearly as much. The Assyrians in 722, you don't have to remember that. I just say it over and over again so that I remember it myself, and maybe if it puts it into some sort of frame of reference for you, great. Come and they conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. You might remember, or you might not, that at the time of Solomon, David and Solomon are about the only time that there's a united kingdom and they're completely independent. Israel in the north and Judah in the south are one kingdom under David and then under Solomon, and after Solomon dies, the two split. And in 722, the Assyrians captured the north. They try to get the south, but they can't conquer Jerusalem. And the Assyrians wipe out the northern kingdom of Israel, and much like Stalin did in the Soviet Union, across the Assyrian Empire, they mixed people. So they would take folks from Assyria and move them elsewhere in the empire, would move people elsewhere into Assyria. And you see little snippets of that in the Bible that make you ask, why are they asking these questions? And you have to have that historical context to understand that's why they're asking. At one point, there are folks who are in the north who are asking about how they should worship the God of the land, and you're going, what do you mean, how should you worship the God of the land? Don't you know they're new people that were brought in, and they realize there's a different God than they're used to, who is the God of this land, and they want to know the right way to worship. Anywho, the capital of the Assyrian Empire is this great city of Nineveh that's talked about in Jonah. So when Jonah gets the word that he's supposed to go to Nineveh, and he's supposed to proclaim a word of the Lord, trying to elicit repentance from Nineveh, he is none too happy about it. He wants to see Nineveh get their comeuppance. They are the enemy. So he flees as far as he can think to flee in the opposite direction. Nineveh is to the east, so he goes west. He gets on a ship at the Great Sea, which is the Mediterranean, that's sailing for Tarshish. We don't know for sure where Tarshish is. We could call it Farshish for all we care, right? Because we just need to know that it's far. Some people think that it's Tunis, which of course was in the ancient world Carthage. Some people think it was in Spain. It's as far west as you could think to get. Now, if I'd read the whole story for you, you'd have heard that once he gets on the boat, and all these other mariners are from different places around, as sailors often are, and they all have their own little g gods, and they get out on the water, and all of a sudden there's this terrible storm that has been sent for Jonah by God. And the mariners begin to panic. What's going on? They're trying to save the boat. They start throwing cargo overboard to try to lighten things. Meanwhile, Jonah, who has just decided it would be better to die and go down with the ship than to listen to God, is down in the hold of the ship sleeping. And the captain of the ship finds Jonah and says, "What are you doing, man? Pray to your God that we'll be saved." Eventually, nobody can figure out what's going on. They cast lots to figure out who did something wrong. They figured this has to be some kind of punishment. And the lot falls on who? Jonah. And they say, "Who are you and what have you done?" And Jonah says, "Well, I'm a prophet of the Lord who made the land and the sea." And they hear "made the sea," and of course they go, "No wonder this is happening to us. And this is what's going on." And they said, "Well, what can we do to save the ship?" And Jonah says, "Well, might as well just throw me overboard. That's the only thing that'll save you." And they don't want to do that. They're a little bit afraid. If this is a prophet from God who made the land and the sea, maybe that's not the best thing to do. So they try really hard to row to shore, and they can't do it. And they finally actually pray themselves to this God that they don't know, "Forgive us for what we're about to do," and they throw him overboard. And I always imagine that if this were done cinematically, that like as soon as he hits the water, everything calms down, right? And if I were on the boat, I'd have like a little life raft that I'd throw, and as soon as he touched it, the storm would start again, and I'd pull it back, and it'd be calm, right? Kind of test it out, you know? Because I'm kind of a squirrel that way. And of course, Jonah begins to sink in the sea. And as he's going down, 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 chapter 2 is his prayer, which kind of reads like a poem when you read it. And this is when the great fish comes and swallows Jonah up. And at the end of the prayer, the fish swims him back, and it actually says in the NRSV uses the word spews. That's a great middle school boy word, right? Spews Jonah up on the shore. And I can imagine him just being kind of covered in fish bile, you know, right? Because again, I'm a squirrel, and I think about these things. And there he is on the shore. And this is where chapter 3 picks up. Never says Jonah took a shower. I'm sort of hoping he did. Although maybe he figured he'd scare Ninevites away if he were still covered in fish stuff. Anyhow, he still is none too happy about what he's doing. You might have caught, as I read chapter 3, that Nineveh took how many days to walk across? 3. How far does he walk? 1. He's not even a half-hearted effort. It's just a third-hearted effort. And in my own sanctified imagination, I hear him, not very convincingly, saying, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. Don't really listen to me. But they do. And boy, do they listen to him. They take it so to heart that every last man, woman, and child, and even their animals, end up fasting in sackcloth and ashes. Wow. Now, Jonah is still hoping that this is not enough. And so as he heads out of the city, I imagine him kind of climbing up a hill. The city's in the, and so he can watch over the city, and he builds himself a sukkah, builds himself a booth. And I've wondered, nobody knows for sure if this is related to Sukkot, which is the Jewish festival where they build the sukkahs right after the High Holy Days. They'll be doing that very shortly. Each temple will have a booth that they build out of sticks and vines and things. It's to be reminded of when they were living in temporary shelters in the wilderness. Some folks think that the original sukkahs were built as sort of places where the crops were initially gathered before they could be brought all the way in from the fields. We don't know that for sure. And if you're an observant Jew, you're supposed to build the sukkah so that it's not really super well built on the top, that it would actually keep out rain. You're supposed to be able to, if you're laying upside down, you're supposed to be able to see the stars through the roof to remember that you're still out of doors and your only real shelter is God. So I imagine this being a sukkah that he's built. And it's sort of shady, but not totally. That's the only way that it makes sense to me that this plant comes up and provides him with additional shade. Otherwise, it's like, aren't you already sitting in the shade, Jonah? What's up? So I imagine that there's this sukkah, there's still sun that's beating through, it's only partial shade. And God sends this vine, this bush, this gourd. I think vine really works well because can you imagine it creeping up the sukkah? You can't imagine a vine unless you're thinking of the big plant that's in the parlor here that somehow stands on its own. It looks like Audrey too. If you ever want to check it out, it's over there. It's enormous. But this vine creeping up the sukkah and a large leaf. It's like the Hebrew word that they use for it is the same now that they call a castor oil plant that has these big leaves. We're not sure if that's exactly the same plant it was back in the day. But so all of a sudden there's this shade for Jonah, and he's like really digging it. I understand this feeling. At Temple Bethel, when we sing there for High Holy Days, have any of you ever been in the building at Bethel? A few of you. Yeah, so it's the big tall one at 14 and Telegraph. It's built to resemble a giant version of the tabernacle, like a tent. And all around the outside, it's windowed. So wherever you are, you can see out all the way around, clear windows. And the choir loft is up kind of toward similarly to where ours is, but there are windows behind it. And on Rosh Hashanah morning and on Yom Kippur morning, when the sun is just right, it is beating on the backs of the choir. And we're roasting. This year, because we had a new person singing tenor, and so I was sitting in the senior tenor spot, I had some shade because I had a pillar. And I was not about to trade spots with Darren because I'm old and I was getting hot. So I was digging the shade, and I could understand, this is just amazing. I'm not cooking. So I was feeling that with Jonah. And that grace for himself he fully accepts, even as he's watching out over Nineveh going, hoping for some good old-fashioned Yahweh smiting. And then, of course, the next day, that little worm eats away at the pillar, the vine, and the vine withers, and the sun's beating back down on him again. And God asks Jonah twice in chapter 4, are you right to be angry? Are you right to be angry? And it reminds me of a different book of the Bible, same chapter, Genesis chapter 4, where God asks Cain, why are you so angry? Yeah, I paid attention to your brother's offering, but as long as you do what's right, you and I are good. Why are you so angry? Because I've extended grace to your brother. And he asks Jonah the same question. Why are you so angry? That I might extend grace to somebody else. This grace that you revel in, this grace that saved you by me sending a big fish to swallow you up from the middle of the sea. This grace which I've saved you by putting the vine over top of you so that you wouldn't feel the heat of the sun. Why? Are you right to be so angry? And it's a rhetorical question because, of course, the answer is no. No. Why, when you're so worried about a bush that you neither planted nor grew nor have anything invested in, why are you so concerned about it, and you would begrudge me being concerned about an entire city of people, 120,000 souls, of people that I created and love? And the book ends, and we're left wondering, what do you suppose Jonah decided? I think like any good story, it ends that way so that we have to figure out, what do we decide? It's the way the story of the prodigal son ended, isn't it? Right? The prodigal son came home and they killed the fatted calf and the ring and all the good stuff and the robe and the older brother, much like Jonah, much like Cain, is angry at this extension of grace by the loving father. The loving father doesn't get mad at the older son. He goes out to see him where he is, talks to him, assures him everything that's here is yours. You and I were good. I am your loving Father. It's only right that when your brother came home, that we would celebrate. And the story is left, how did the older brother respond? Did he go off and sulk? Or did he come in and enjoy the party? That's the choice that we're left with. Will we seek restoration? In those places in our lives, in our families, in our communities, in our churches where there is brokenness, will we seek peace? Let us choose grace. Let us choose that reckless love that the loving Father showed to the prodigal. Do you remember that? That's one of, I think, the most startling images to me in that whole story. I picture it in my mind that every day the father is out plowing in the field, and just every once in a while casts a glance over his shoulder, hoping beyond hope that the son is coming home, until one day, with a glance that he's not expecting to see anything, he sees that first little crop of hair coming up over the hill. And instead of thinking, well, I'm going to let him come home and grovel in front of me with that speech I'm sure he's rehearsed, he drops everything and he runs out to meet him. I'm not sure that I would have been as charitable. There would be those among us who would be like, oh, he finally decided to come home, eh? I'll wait till he gets all the way in. Maybe I'll pretend I don't see him. I'll go inside. I'll let him come inside the house wondering how I'm going to feel. And then he's going to give his whole spiel about how he screwed up. And then I'll forgive him, of course. But I want him to grovel first. But God doesn't even want that. God runs and asks us, why are you so angry? Are you right to be so angry? No. Choose grace. Choose love. Amen.